Hello. Welcome to the studio. Actually, you can tell I'm in the studio when I'm wearing my camouflage clothes, unintentionally camouflage. But yeah, this is my natural environment, and you've caught me in the wild. So welcome to my studio. This is going to be my first Q&A video. I'm very excited about it because I just reached my 500th subscriber about an hour before I started filming this video. And I'm very excited by that. And I know that 500 subscribers is not a big milestone in the greater YouTube universe, but it's big for me. And I have all of you to thank for that. Your likes, the subscribes, of course, but also the engagement. And that's what today is about. I've got 3 really good questions, very encompassing questions from a viewer in Germany. And so let's also take a moment to celebrate just the wild notion in my mind that a Canadian dude can just post a video on YouTube and somebody from Germany sees it and asks questions and I'm able to respond. I mean, that's just trippy, and what a fun time we're living in, I think. Now, I'm going to apologize in advance to the viewer because I'm not going to pronounce your name properly. I'm quite sure I'm dyslexic and an artist and a very long way from being a linguist. I'm going to say Aljosha, but I'm sure that's not it. So I will respectfully call you Al. Let's shorten it to Al just for my sake. So Al, the 3 questions are about varnish, paints that I use, and a calibrated monitor for working from photos. So if you're interested in that, let's get into the questions. So yeah, okay, let's get into it. So question number 1, I just listened to an episode of The Artful Painter in which Virgil Elliott described that artists should avoid using retouch varnish, especially when applying it just when the paint is dry to the touch, because it can absorb some of the paint. And when you want to get rid of the retouch varnish in order to put on a final varnish coat, you could pick up some of the paint in the process. Just wanted to know your opinion on that and the way you handle it with paintings that you want to give to clients as soon as possible. So there's 3 elements to that question. The first element about the absorption, yeah, that's absolutely factual. If you put on retouch varnish and it isn't thoroughly, and I'm stressing that word, thoroughly dry to the touch, you're going to reabsorb the paint. So a lot of us, when we're checking, just kind of poke in spots. You need to check the entire surface of that painting, because if there's any tackiness anywhere, it's going to be a problem. And oil paint pigments dry at wildly different rates. So some of them can dry in hours, some take days. So it's got to be completely and thoroughly dry to the touch, and then you can use your retouch varnish. Now, everybody that uses that method, it's sort of, retouch varnish is involved in sort of the layering and glazing method of painting, where you do a thin layer of oil paint, glaze it to reawaken it and bring it back to its luster after it's dried, and then you can paint another thin layer, and so on and so forth. So the retouch varnish is made to evaporate over time, and it's made to integrate with that second and third and fourth and so on layers of paint. So you do want the first paint to be solid, you want the next layer to be completely dry and solid, and then you want the next one, and so on. So the part that's confusing to me is that second part, because there's no reason that I can think of, and I've done a lot of research on it, to why you would ever need to remove the retouch varnish to do a final varnish coat. That's not a thing I've heard of. So maybe the context is something I didn't quite get. I'm not familiar with Virgil Elliott, so maybe they didn't mean it that way. I don't know. But I've not found anything. And I've talked directly with Gamblin and Winsor Newton both on it, and they didn't seem to get that either. So that part is confusing to me. So if you have further questions about that, I would contact, Gamblin is extremely responsive, so I would contact them directly and ask them to flesh it out a bit further for you, if I haven't reassured you. Now the third thing is turnaround time to clients. So I use, as a final varnish, I use Gamblin's Gamvar, which is a revolutionary step forward in the way we do varnish. Typically in the old days, you had to wait at minimum of 6 months, but preferably 12 to 18 months before you varnished a painting. The reason for that is because oil paint doesn't dry, it actually cures. And part of that curing process is involving oxygen. It needs to have oxidization. And so if you prematurely varnished, you cut off the paint's ability to interact with oxygen molecules. And that would lead to premature cracking and a much shorter life of your painting typically. So this varnish that Gamblin sells, the Gamvar, is revolutionary because you can actually do a final varnish coat on your painting when it is dry to the touch. And again, thoroughly dry to the touch. I mean, when mine are thoroughly dry to the touch, I usually give them another week before I do a final varnish coat. Just peace of mind for me. I'm paranoid. So that's my thing. But it's amazing, and I'm going to really annoy any of chemists out there that would know the real hardcore details of this, because I'm going to simplify it to an almost crazy point. But basically what they did is create a varnish that allows the smallest oxygen molecules to penetrate, but the pollutants can't. And so it still protects the painting but allows the oxidization to occur. So it is revolutionary. It's a fantastic varnish. So the turnaround time, if you want it to be, is from final brush strokes to final varnish coat could be a matter of a week or two. So that's incredible. If I didn't quite get everything you needed there, or I messed up a context that Virgil Elliott was talking about, just hit me back up and we'll try again. So question number 2, what kind of yellow do I use? I wanted to switch from cadmium to another yellow because cadmium is so expensive. So would Winsor yellow be a good alternative? Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I like Winsor Newton paints enormously, and Gamblin paints. They are pretty much what I use in my studio. Now, over my 20 years, I have experimented with every paint company and most of the paints that they produce. Some pigments don't appeal to me, fluorescent things or whatever that I probably would never use. So I haven't tried some of those, but I've tried most of them. Mostly because I'm a very curious individual and I want to know that the things I'm choosing to use in my studio, I'm choosing because I'm fully informed and they are what I've landed with after I've tried everything. And I started with these paints and I've kind of circled right back to them. Now, one of the reasons why is because I use a lot of hues. Now, this is a sticking point for a lot of artists. A lot of artists are not excited about hue-based paints whatsoever. I think, in my opinion, that it's more of a reputational issue than it is a quality-based issue. I think a lot of them think they're of lesser quality, but I don't think they are. I think the thing that they don't like about them is they're not actually the ground metal that they are used to using. So a cerulean blue, for example, has a cerulean blue hue. It doesn't have cerulean in it. It's called cerulean blue hue, so the artist using that hue knows what it's supposed to mimic. So for those who don't know what the hues are, just think of them as a facsimile. It is like a cerulean blue, but not actually made from cerulean. I think that particular one is made by with phthalo in different recipes. So here's the thing, though, for me, is that I think that the paints that we are using today as artists are the best paints that mankind has used in history, and I think that's very arguable. And I think that the quality of these things, even the hues, is superb. The results that I get from it are amazing. I've actually had cerulean blue and cerulean blue hue on my palette just for my own peace of mind to see how far away they were from each other, and I had a devil of a time telling which was which. So I'm one of the artists, I guess, in the crowd that I'm looking for a certain color. Maybe that's the way we should say it. And I don't much care if it's actually cerulean that gives me that color, or if it's cadmium that's giving me that type of yellow or red. I don't really care. It's the color itself I'm looking for. So if they've perfected a recipe over decades that mimics that cerulean or that cadmium yellow or that cadmium red or the cobalt, then that's good enough for me. So to me, it's just an affordability issue, and you're specifically targeting the cost of cadmiums, which has quintupled since I started painting. And part of that is how difficult it is to mine. And there was a lot of people, when I first started painting in 2002, a lot of articles actually in magazines have written about it, saying that in the near future, painting companies wouldn't have those rarefied metals in their pigments anymore. And so when I started painting, that's why I chose hues. Because I just thought, well, I guess I better get used to them. I mean, they made it sound like within 5 to 10 years we would no longer have those metals in the paint. And so as a young guy starting out, I thought, okay, well, I guess I'll just do the hues because we're all going to have to get used to them sooner or later. Interestingly enough, I just read an article a couple months ago that was renewing that issue. So I mean, part of the affordability is crazy. I mean, the last time I bought a cobalt blue, I think was 80, 90 bucks for the tube. And the cobalt blue hue, which looks identical to my eyes, was $22. So you're on the right road looking for affordable alternatives, I think. And the hues are the way to go in that regard, I think. So try them out. Tell me what you think. And different paints operate differently. I like these ones and the Gamblin ones particularly because of the buttery consistency. The body of these paints work well with how I paint. If you're a glazer and layer like we talked before, you may find that a looser, runnier paint would work for you. So just to have fun, experiment, try things, and what settles for you is what you should use. So hopefully that helps. Now the last question is that Al says, I have just bought a calibrated monitor for painting from photos. So is your monitor on the left that you paint from, is that calibrated? It's not, actually. The calibration is good and it'll help you with printing and other issues, but it's not going to help correct the essential issues with the photo itself. So I'll throw out a caveat here because it's going to sound like I'm knocking photography, and I am not at all. I consider myself an amateur photographer, and I have a lot of friends who are fine art photographers and professional photographers, and it's an amazing art form. And actually, cameras and photographs today are giving us more information and better information than they ever have. So it's a good time in history to be a photographer. So no insults to that whatsoever, no negative knocking on that at all. It's just that a photograph doesn't give artists the exact information that they're looking for. So what do I mean by that? I mean, if you've ever painted from life, you're going to know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't painted from life, I heavily encourage you to start. It's not only going to teach you things you can't learn from painting from a photograph, but it's going to teach you things associated with how to help photographs be better for you. So it's going to help your studio practice as well. But it's also just going to be a great teacher and exercise an observational skill in you, which I think all artists really do need. So painting from life, I mean, if you're a realist on any level, impressionist or otherwise, you're painting something that's supposed to look like what it is. So you're painting something that lives in a three-dimensional world, as we do. And if I paint when I'm viewing that in a three-dimensional world, that's my best advantage to capture the illusion of it on a two-dimensional surface, like a painting canvas. The second I go to a photograph, I've lost that single best advantage because that three-dimensional world is erased. And the perspectives can often be quite weird in photographs as a result of that. It affects the proportions of your subjects. Like if I'm doing a boxer, you know, kind of coming towards the viewer, that's a lot of foreshortening. That's going to look really weird in the photo. Much different than it would if I had a model posing for me. It's going to be very different, or a horse running towards you, anything like that. It's also going to affect the values and the colors, but the saturation and temperatures of those colors. So pretty much everything is going to be altered to some degree. So now that's going to make it sound like I'm knocking using photos as reference. I'm not. I think photos are an excellent source of reference for artists. I think, though, the answer to shore up some of the shortcomings of it is to paint from life. The more you paint from life, the more you build up kind of a visual memory bank that you can refer to that helps you understand what that photo is lacking and what you need to do to make your painting more compelling as a result of it. So paint from life as much as you can. Paint on plein air, your landscapes out in life, paint portraits from life, paint still lifes, the whole gamut. Just paint from life as often as you can, because the more you paint from life, the more you're making that memory bank account bigger. And the more information you have to help shore up the photographic reference. So if you've painted 25 times out doing landscapes on plein air, and then you have a landscape in a photo and it doesn't quite look right, it looks too flat, there's not the atmospheric perspective and distancing you're needing, you'll know from those 25 experiences what that photograph needs to make your painting believable. And that also exercises a very interesting muscle for artists, which is the conceptual muscle. So a lot of us spend a lot of time learning to paint what we see, not what we know, because the logic mind can trick us. And if you're curious about that, I can unpack that in a future episode. So if you're interested in that and having me unpack that, drop a comment in the section below and I'll plan that video. But yeah, our logic mind will interrupt things. It'll kind of boss us. So we train ourselves to paint what we see, not what we know. But there's another muscle though too. There's a whole other type of painting which is totally imaginary, entirely just created from your mind, your imagination, your memory, all those things. That's somewhat referred to as conceptual painting. So when you work from a photograph, you're kind of treading both worlds, and that gives you kind of an artistic full body exercise. You're painting from a reference, but also from conceptual and memory information. So it really rounds you out as an artist. So there's a lot of benefits to painting from both sources, from life and from photograph, and from conceptual. So the third is also good. So I hope that helps and answers those questions. Let me know if you've got more. And thanks very much, Al. I appreciate it, from Germany. It's so exciting. And a shout out to another viewer, Bazinator. So Baz, if you're watching, I'm just going to put up a picture of my palette, and I'll explain the colors that I use because I know you were interested in that. Okay, so here is the picture of the palette itself. It's my everyday palette. I use it for portraits, landscapes, still life, anything that I'm painting. These are the colors that I use. I'm not really a guy who changes his colors a lot depending on the subject, except when I'm doing really explosive, vibrantly colored paintings, then I'll bump up to a more aggressive palette. And I have a video upcoming planned to just really unpack color use and how I color mix and everything a little bit more. I've got a brief 2-minute tip that sort of skirts it, and then I'm going to be doing a much more in-depth video as well. So if you have any questions about color or the use of a palette, throw them down in the comments below. And thanks for the question, Baz. And for the medium that I use, it's Gamsol with linseed oil mixed in. 4 parts Gamsol, 2 parts linseed. And I don't use medium a ton, but when I do, that's what I like to use. So thank you very much, and again, thank you for helping me to make my channel successful. You're great, and thanks for being part of the journey. I really appreciate it. So go on now and be safe and get painting, because as I always say, nothing helps you improve as a painter more than miles on the brush. So just paint, paint, paint. And I'll see you all in the next video. Thank you very much.